Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, NJCTS, its directors and employees assume no responsibility for the accuracy, completeness, or objectivity or usefulness of the information presented on our site. We do not endorse any recommendation or opinion made by any member or physician, nor do we advocate any treatment. You are responsible for your own medical decisions. Now I'm going to turn over the introductions of our speaker to Martha Butterfield, the Program Coordinator of NJCTS. Marty?
Kelly, thank you. Hi everyone, good evening, and thank you for joining us on our Wednesday webinar. We're pleased to have so many attendees tonight. We have a great presentation for you, so I want to get right to the introduction of our speaker, Susan Connors. We've known Sue for many years. She's had a long career in education and advocacy, working with children and families living with Tourette syndrome. She is a retired teacher who taught middle school in upstate New York for 33 years. She served many years on the board of directors for the National Tourette Syndrome Association and was founder and chair of their education committee. While at National TSA, she worked for 7 years as their education specialist. In that capacity, she traveled extensively across the U.S., including Puerto Rico, as well as other countries around the world, consulting and presenting workshops on Tourette. Sue has won numerous local, state, and national awards for her work in this field. She's consulted with and made appearances on a number of television programs featuring information on TS. She's published numerous articles, brochures, videos, and book chapters on the education of children with TS, and recently published her first book entitled The Tourette Syndrome and OCD Checklist, a practical reference for parents and educators. When it comes to information and discussion about Tourette, Sue knows what she's talking about because she has Tourette herself, as do other members of her family. So Sue, welcome. We're delighted to have you become part of our Wednesday webinar series. So without further introduction, I'm going to turn tonight's presentation over to you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's nice to be doing this. I like to start my presentation. I think part of what I do is to try to teach people not only what Tourette is, but what it isn't. And I think one of those things includes changing the way we look at people with neurological disorders in general. So because of that, I'd like to start my presentation with this quote that I have up on the screen right now. And if you've seen it, kind of bear with me as I read it. I've come to the conclusion that I am the decisive element in the classroom. It is my personal approach that creates the climate. It is my daily mood that makes the weather. As a teacher, I possess a tremendous power to make a child's life miserable or joyous. I can be a tool of torture or an instrument of inspiration. I can humiliate or honor, hurt or heal. In all situations, it is my response that decides whether a crisis will be escalated or de-escalated, and a child humanized or dehumanized. I read that quote as a second-year teacher at age 21, and I think it probably meant more to me than it did to many, many other people that have probably read this over the years, because this was pretty much my life. I have Tourette. I started with my symptoms when I was 6, and I did not get my diagnosis until I had taught 15 years and was 36 years old. And so my life was made pretty miserable at times, and I was very often humiliated, hurt, punished, made fun of, teased, imitated, all of these things. But I think most importantly about this is that as educators, we really need to remember and be reminded every day of what our role in that classroom is. Besides teaching subject material, we're creating a climate. We're creating a climate for kids to learn. And if the way we treat any child in that room gives everybody else in the room the permission to treat that child the same way. So I've always enjoyed that quote, and I actually hung it on my classroom wall for 31 years and still have it in the back of my closet. But yet I'm also very aware, as a former middle school teacher for 33 years, that we've all had these days. If I had but one life to give for my country, it would be Billy in the third row. And I jokingly put this up, but I think one of the reasons that this is particularly important to this talk today is that children with Tourette syndrome can be some of the most challenging kids you will ever work with. And not because of the fact that they have Tourette or they're difficult children, because one of the things we're going to talk a lot about today is that Tourette is a disorder that constantly changes. I always tell people the only predictable thing about Tourette is unpredictability. And what you see today may not be what you see tomorrow. If you taught a child with Tourette last year, 2 years from now, you may never have another child with Tourette who is completely different. And that's the challenging part, that every day creates a new challenge. And not only that, as many of you know, Tourette is not just tics. Tourette is a lot of things. It's a spectrum, and Tourette is tics, but also a ton of associated disorders that we're all going to address today. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to go through a lot of the material as quickly as I can so I can get it all in. Now, as you know, the main feature of a person with Tourette is a tic. And a tic is nothing more than an involuntary, repetitive motor movement of some sort or vocalization. That's basically what a tic is. And a tic is caused, I mean, even though at times I know it looks very psychological, almost, psychiatric and emotional kind of problem, it's nothing more than a chemical imbalance in the brain that affects your dopamine system, which is part of the brain that controls movement. And so people who have Tourette and things aren't working properly in that system have these involuntary repetitive motor movements of some sort or vocalizations. But I think the tics themselves are something that makes, that are difficult to understand, because most people think of a tic as what we would refer to as a simple tic. But there are actually two different kinds of tics. Now, one of the other things I need to say is that, because we still don't know all we need to know about Tourette, and Tourette still does not have a medical test. That's why it's still called a syndrome. And so we diagnose it through criteria. And the first criteria for diagnosis is actually multiple motor tics. Now, what we think of, or what most people think of as a tic, is what we would refer to as a simple motor tic. And that's something that looks like a tic. Your eyes are blinking, you're doing a facial grimace of some sort, your nose may twitch, you may have a leg movement, a shoulder shrug, an arm or head jerk. A simple motor tic is the movement of one muscular group in your body, and it looks like a tic. However, at some point in a person's life, most people will develop some sort of a complex motor tic. And complex motor tics don't look like tics at all, and they are often misinterpreted as behaviors. The child trying to get attention from everyone, trying to be the class clown. I'm talking about things like hopping, clapping, a throwing movement, touching. Touching tics are very, very common, where you have to touch certain things. You have to sometimes touch yourself or another person, or sometimes inappropriately. When I was in my late 20s, I had a tic where if I was standing in a line behind someone, close enough to be able to reach them, I had to tap them on the shoulder. And as a 5th or 6th grader, and you do that, and then you pretend it's not you, that's typical 5th or 6th grade behavior. But when you're almost 30, it's ridiculous, and it's very embarrassing. And that was clearly a tic, but it didn't look like a tic. I've worked with kids who will have to get out of their chair and twirl and then sit back down again. I observed a little girl one time who had a twirling tic, and when I went to observe her class, because the teacher was complaining about how disruptive it was, the minute I sat down and started watching, I realized why it was so disruptive, and that is because the girl was seated in the center of the classroom. And so every time she got up and twirled, which was probably 10 times a class period, every time she had to do that, she was obviously the center of attention, and it was disruptive. But my thoughts went immediately to this child. Not only was it a disruptive tic where she was seated, but it was also horribly embarrassing for that little girl, because everybody's attention was called to it. So, so many times when you're trying to think of how to manage tics in a classroom, it's so easy to say, stop doing that. That's human nature, to say, stop making that noise, get back in your seat, you don't need to be out of your seat hopping, why are you sticking out your tongue? But if they're tics, they can't help it. And so we have to think of what we call environmental modifications. And the one for that particular child was simply taking that little girl's seat and moving her to the side of the classroom away from the center of things. And then when she stood up and twirled, it didn't bother anyone. She was also closer to the classroom door, so she could take little breaks now and then, which is something we'll talk about. I've worked with kids who have, very, very unusual, obscene gestures called copropraxia, repeating someone else's actions, echopraxia. Imagine if you're teaching and you've got a child in your room who is repeating, it looks like they're imitating a certain mannerism you might have. And indeed, if it's a child with Tourette, it could very well be that. A little girl I'm working right now has a handstand tic, but she actually has to get out of her desk and stand on her hands. and she stiffens up her body, and then she goes back to her seat again. And, you know, once I went in and educated the classmates and educated the teachers, we found a perfect place in the classroom to put this little girl right up by the classroom door. When I went in after about 2 weeks to actually do the peer in service, the teachers had very nicely put a gym mat next to the girl's desk because they were really worried about her doing it, sitting on her hands and hurting herself. So, you know, I didn't hear from that school for the next, 10 months. And the reason is everybody understood it. Everybody knew what it was. They had her in a place that wasn't disruptive. End of issue. Now, the second criteria, the second diagnostic criteria, that we have vocal tics. And the vocal tics can sometimes be one of the most, I think, one of the most problematic parts. But again, we divide them into simple and complex. A simple vocal tic is a noise you make. It could be a whistling sound, a coughing sound, a sniffing sound, a screeching sound, an animal noise. And those are things, once again, you may see as a tic. My first vocal tic ever was sniffing. I constantly sniffed through, I think I was in second grade, and I remember having the teacher put tissues on my desk over and over and over again. Go out and blow your nose, go out and blow your nose, go out and blow your nose. And no matter how many times I blew my nose, I couldn't stop because that was a sniffing tic. But at some point, many, many people will develop a complex vocal tic. And a complex vocal tic is something linguistically meaningful that you say, like you just suddenly saying something out of nowhere. And sometimes in a normal tone of voice, sometimes it has to be in a certain pitch of voice. Sometimes it has to be very loud to satisfy the tic. I've got it, oh boy, now you've seen it. I worked with a little girl about a year ago now, whose vocal tic at the time I was working with her school was actually saying peanut butter. And, it was such a silly little tic, but everybody, no one in the class understood what it was. And so you can imagine every time she said it, Haley, will you stop saying that? Would you please stop saying that? Why you keep saying peanut butter? Because nobody understood why she kept saying that. But once everybody was on board and understood what it was kind of cute, because every time she was an elementary student, every time from then on that she would say peanut butter, the whole class would just go jelly and kind of go along with the tic. I actually had a boy in my class the last 4 years I was teaching. I was a middle school French teacher and tended to have kids over and over again. And when I had him in 5th grade for the first year, all of his vocal tics were animal noises. So we'd be teaching and I'd be hearing, meow, I kind of got used to that after a while. It wasn't such a big deal. When I had him in 6th grade, he developed a much more complex vocal tic when he was actually saying, chickens are fuzzy, chickens are fuzzy. It seems so bizarre to have a kid just sitting there saying that, but clearly it was a vocal tic. In 7th grade, his vocal tics were mainly grunting, sniffing, those kind of things. When I had him in 8th grade, toward the middle of the first semester, he developed one of the funniest vocal tics I've probably ever heard. And I had him first period, so I heard it first. And all of a sudden in the class one day, I hear, "I got a chicken in my pants." He just had to shout that tic out. And, it was so interesting because in 5th grade, when so few people knew him, and he was, making animal noises, we had a lot of social issues that we had to deal with. By the time he was in 8th grade and everyone had been educated, I can remember very well the first time he yelled out, "I got a chicken in my pants." The 8th grade boy sitting next to him turned around and looked at him and put his thumb up and went, "Oh, Marty, great new tic." They were very amused and thought that was such an interesting tic to have. Vocal tics can be speech atypicalities, where you will be talking and all of a sudden your voice goes up or your voice goes down again, a sudden change in the rhythm of your voice or a tone of voice. I've worked with several kids over the years who will suddenly have to speak in a foreign accent. I had a boy in my class going back probably 15 years now, and he suddenly had to speak in the most perfect British accent. And after about 6 months, that just went away, and we welcomed him back to America, and he came back to the normal American accent again. If the intensity of speech changes, I worked with a girl who had to speak in baby talk. She had to say all of her vocal tics had to be said in baby talk. Stutter, which appears to be stuttering but is not a true stuttering, can be a vocal tic. You can see where a lot of these kids get referred over the years that their tics change to speech-language pathologists in school districts because so much of it seems more like a speech problem. And then, of course, the 3 most unusual vocal tics, echolalia, where you have to echo what you hear somebody else say. I had a boy in my class who would say just the last 3 words of every sentence I said. If I would say, okay, let's take our seats, he would say, take our seats. You need to take out a pen and a piece of paper. And not only would he repeat the last 3 words, but he'd say it in my exact tone of voice, which, you know, even me as a person with Tourette and totally understanding it, it took me a good week to really adjust to that constantly going on in the classroom, but I got used to it. Polylalia, where you have to repeat your own words, and then, of course, the one that everybody seems to have heard about, and so many people think that if you have Tourette, that's the main symptom, and that is something called coprolalia, which is the involuntary utterance of curse words or socially inappropriate phrases or sentences that is a vocal tic. Now, you will note at the bottom of the screen that one of the most important things I'll probably tell you, and that is coprolalia is not necessary for a diagnosis. And very few people, probably 15 to 20% of the Tourette population, actually get that symptom. But as you can imagine, it is one of the more problematic ones. And one of the reasons is, you know, most people also think it's always a curse word, but it doesn't have to be a curse word. It's anything inappropriate. It could be a sexual comment. It could be an ethnic slur. I've worked with a lot of kids who have ethnic slurs. I worked with a little boy last year who had to actually yell out, "I had sex last night." That was his vocal tic. Really difficult symptoms, especially because he was in a parochial school. But that's another story. But, you know, and the other thing that people think about coprolalia is that it's always at random, but it's not. I have that symptom, and mine is almost always at random. But with a lot of people, you know, Tourette is very suggestible. So it can be directly triggered by something in the environment. You know, if you see a person of a certain ethnicity, you might have to yell out that ethnic slur. And it seems so deliberate. So it's not always just a random kind of thought that people have. The third thing we look at, and this is the one that I think is one of the most problematic parts of it, is that the tics constantly wax and wane. Not only do they normally just change constantly, especially in childhood, kids get new tics all the time, but they change. You know, you never know from week to week, from day to day, what tic is going to go away, what tics are going to be added on. You know, the brain chemistry is changing pretty rapidly when you're a child, so you get new tics all the time. As an adult, that doesn't happen as much. Your tics seem to settle in for much longer periods of time. Typically, tics seem to worsen during pre-puberty and puberty, and I think everybody can understand that. And then the good news is, with a lot of people, they do less than in adulthood. Doesn't necessarily have to happen. Mine didn't, but a lot of people that does happen. Waxing and waning also means, and this is something that will really drive the management in the classroom, and this is the fact that tics worsen in severity depending on certain environmental factors. And the things that definitely worsen Tourette are stress and anxiety, top of the list. Tics will almost always be worse when you're stressed. Excitement makes tics worse. You know, I used to forget about that. There's a field day. There's a holiday coming up. Something fun is going to happen, or having a special activity in class. Fatigue tends to worsen them. You know, a lot of times you will see many more symptoms at the end of the day than you do the beginning of the day because of the fatigue level. Parents will always, always, always see many more tics at home because kids really try very hard to suppress the symptoms, which we'll talk about. And you know, it is something that people can do. You can hold those symptoms in for very limited amounts of time. But the problem with doing that is it takes so much energy and concentration to do it, and you never suppress them forever. You know, I compare it to trying to suppress a sneeze. You know, if you have to sneeze and you keep trying really, really hard, I'm not going to sneeze, I'm not going to sneeze, by the time you finally sneeze, it's going to be a very loud, much louder sneeze than it was to begin with. I also compare it to trying not to blink your eyes. Eye blinking is a natural human movement, and we try out very hard. You know, if we tried very hard, we could possibly not blink our eyes for 10 or 15 seconds. But after about, you know, those 10 seconds, 15 seconds are up, your eyes are burning, and it's almost impossible to continue to do. And the minute somebody says to you, now you can blink your eyes are going to blink very rapidly because it was hard to suppress. But think about it. If all the while you're sitting there trying not to blink your eyes, if somebody keeps talking to you, are you really listening to them? No, you try not to blink your eyes. So unfortunately, concentration goes right out the window. And a lot of times, you know, kids will try really hard, and they're failing everything. They shut down in school. They explode when they get home because they've had no relief during the day to get those tics out. Now, just some of the classroom suggestions for the tics. I'm talking about things like, frequent breaks, something as simple as allowing that child to get out of their seat and take a walk down the hall for a few minutes. Even if it's 3 or 4 minutes, give them a laminated pass. That makes a huge difference in the kid's ability to sit, attend, and, just to give them that outlet in a safer, more private environment. I've oftentimes suggested teachers just give the child a set of, tokens or a set of laminated cards every day. Here are your 8 cards for the day, and you can use them for a 3 or 4 minute break. You can go to the following 4 places, and you can't use more than 1 per class period, and just really set up the parameters. And, their body is out of control. It's part of their disorder. And this kind of helps them learn to self-monitor, which is really our goal with these kids. We've already talked about preferential seating, looking at the interference of individual tics for a particular accommodation. I am a huge proponent of educating the other kids about Tourette, which of course you can't do if you haven't got parent permission, but it makes a huge difference, and I've actually created a peer education in-service that I am more than happy to share with anyone. That really, it's a program about differences. And you notice at the bottom I put Skype. I've worked with a number of kids that have had extremely loud, very, very disruptive vocal tics that are pretty constant for certain periods in their life. And it's very difficult to be instructing a class when someone is screeching every 3 or 4 seconds, which, happens with very, very severe cases of Tourette. So a lot of times what I've suggested, and it's worked really well with quite a few kids that I worked with, is setting up a room in the school where you can set up a laptop computer. Sometimes it's even a little storage room somewhere, and that has Skype available on it, or download Skype onto it. It's a free download, and then the teacher in the classroom will have Skype also. The child at any point can get up and, when they feel their tics are getting too loud and disruptive, leave the room, go down to their little, we call it the Skype room, turn on their computer, the teacher puts on Skype. They can still tune in on the class without feeling like they're disrupting the class. And it actually helps the tics calm down because the stress level is reduced. Now, we talked at the beginning about the fact that, Tourette is tics, and we've just gone through all the tics and what you have to have for the diagnosis. But, unfortunately, Tourette is a spectrum disorder, and it is almost always accompanied by other neurological conditions. I personally, in the 26 years I've been doing this, have never met a person who has just tics. They may be out there, I've just not met them yet. But the most common are the obsessive compulsive disorder, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and learning disabilities. Those 3 at the very top of the list. A huge number of people with Tourette have at least 1 or 2 of these disorders, and many have all 3. But there's also another list, which of maybe not the high percentages that OCD, ADHD, and learning disabilities are, but they certainly do occur in many, many people with Tourette. I'm talking about executive dysfunction. That's the kid who is horribly, completely disorganized. It now has a new name. It's called executive dysfunction, and we're going to talk about that. Depression can be a very common associated disorder, and it's really hard sometimes to assess depression in kids, because kids who are depressed don't always curl up and cry like adults do. They will start acting out and sometimes become more oppositional, sometimes become more defiant, and those are signs of depression in kids, so we don't always see it for what it is. Anxiety disorders go very much along with the OCD. Sleep disorders are very prevalent. Kids, and again, you won't see that in the classroom, but you certainly will see the effects of it. If a child is dealing with insomnia, if a child is dealing with, night terrors, or, inability to get up in the morning, it's a really deep sleep they go into, walking in their sleep, talking in their sleep, any number of sleep disorders, it affects their performance the next day. I think one of the disabilities, and it is now considered a nonverbal learning disability that we're going to talk about in a second, is called, that I see probably with 90% of the kids, those are my own statistics that I work with, is something called dysgraphia, which is a fine motor deficit. We learned a lot about dyslexia, but very little has been known over the years about dysgraphia, which is very prevalent in kids with Tourette. We're going to talk somewhat about the aggressive and explosive behavior. Pardon? Sensory defensiveness, sensory issues. We're going to talk about that. And then also we have the social skills deficits. So you can see that with Tourette, it's not just the tics. We've got all this other stuff. And you know, I have to honestly say that the average child I work with probably has 5 or 6 of these associated disorders that are sometimes even more problematic at any time in their life than the tics themselves. And I'm going to start by looking at the OCD, which I think is the most commonly, the most closely, I should say, associated with Tourette. I have OCD, and I've always called it tics of my mind. You know, my body tics, my mind tics. My head is jerking, my shoulder is shrugging, my mind is stuck on something, and I can't move on from it. Now, you know, I think, but like with Tourette, when we think of Tourette, we think of swearing. Many people, when they think of OCD, think of germs, because that's the one that's most often portrayed in the media. But there are so many manifestations of OCD. I've got a list, but it certainly doesn't cover everything that could possibly exist. Need for symmetry and perfectionism. You know, and it's so interesting. We're going to talk in a second about the red flags that you will see for this and how you recognize this in a child. You know, and it doesn't have to be somebody who is, everything in their life has to be symmetrical. But, you know, there are certain things. Like, you know, if you were to look into my bedroom now, my bedspread is hanging perfectly evenly on every single side of my bed. But, you know, not everything else in my house is quite as neat and organized. And because it's not everything. And you see kids in school who, it's certain things, it's not everything. The neatness goes along with that. Counting. And, you know, what's so difficult about the OCD is that it takes place in your head, as I said, and you don't always know a child is doing it. I worked with a girl last year who her grades were really plummeting because she had developed an obsession where she could only read 3 words at a time, and whatever she was reading, she'd read the 3 words, she would stop, and she had to read them 3 more times so they sounded just right in her head. Then she had to close the book that she was reading and tap 3 times on the cover, and then she could go on to the next 3 words, and she'd read those 3 times each so they sounded just right, then close the book, tap 3 times on the cover, and was getting nothing done. But nobody knew she was doing it until she actually told me about it, so we didn't understand why her grades were plummeting. Checking things over and over. These are the kids that are the last ones to turn in their test papers because they have to keep going back over and over it again. They have to check certain things to make sure, you know, before they leave the room. And, you know, I have many checking obsessions that are much better with medication than they used to be, but, you know, where I have checked certain things in the house before I leave, and many times have to check them 4 and 5 times each before I can be satisfied. You know, the doubt and worrying goes along with the anxiety. And it's so difficult. You know, kids who have anxiety, it seems so much like an avoidance behavior. You know, they just don't want to go to school, so they're going to say they have anxiety. But it's very real. It's very irrational, and it's very real. And I've had many kids that I've worked with over the years who have had a lot of issues. You know, if they're in school, they're worrying all day long that something bad's going to happen to their mom. They have to call home 3 times a day. You know, there's a constant worry about something very irrational in their life that no one else would even think about, but they have become obsessed with. Germ obsessions. These are the kids who are constantly washing their hands over and over and over again. They won't walk out of a door unless they put their sleeve down over their hand. They're worried about catching other people's obsessions. Somebody sneezes and they, you know, go into almost a tirade in your classroom because the germs are being spread. But most kids with OCD have a lot of trouble with transitions, moving from one activity to another within a classroom with not a lot of preparation. You know, if you just say, okay, close that book and let's take this out. They're cognitively, they can't switch gears that quickly, and because of that, the transitions are very hard for them. Anything that requires change, you know, if you come in one day and there's a substitute teacher, it throws them for a loop. They're going to have a very miserable and probably, you know, behaviorally difficult day because that sub isn't doing things just the way the natural teacher did, the regular teacher did. If they come into the classroom and there's a, you know, if they have a special schedule for that day, any number of things can set them off. Rituals, certain rituals they have to go through. You have to do this so many times, or you have to walk, if you walk, you know, into the door, you got to back out of it. You know, a lot of little ritualistic kind of things. And one of the things that I think we see with so many kids, and this is my own kind of little coined expression, I call it the obsessive sense of justice. A lot of our kids, you know, these are the kids who will constantly, if something happens in the classroom and you don't see it happening, they're going to be the first to let you know. You know, what we used to call the tattletales. You have to know what's going on in that room. They will debate over, whether you've got, if you cheated them out of a half a point on a test, they will debate you endlessly because it's just not fair. If they didn't get away with something and they got punished for it and someone else did, they can't let it go. And I've done whole behavior plans just around that obsessive sense of justice. In managing OCD in the classroom, every single obsession almost, at the bottom of the screen I have be creative because that's about the best I can offer you. Obsessions, for example, with erasing words over and over again, it's a symmetry obsession. If you've got a kid who's constantly writing and erasing, you can assume it's a symmetry obsession. And they may need, while they have that particular obsession, they may need some writing accommodations, whether it's a scribe for a younger student or the use of a word processor, voice-activated software, because they're not getting their work done if they're constantly erasing. A counting compulsion, like the little girl who was counting that I just described, we eventually got her all of her books on tape for her because she just couldn't read anymore. She had to have something to listen to. Most of these kids need time limits waived, extended time. They don't always take it, but to calm down the stress, which then aggravates the symptoms. Advance warning for any changes. Distraction works really well. A little girl I worked with for many years calls it her hamster on the wheel, and I absolutely love that analogy. She said that hamster's going round and round and round and round, and they won't get off. And sometimes when you can just distract them to break that loop, send them on a quick errand that's very important, even though it's a made-up errand. Using humor. I use humor all the time to help with all aspects of my disorder. And look for the red flags for OCD. There are a lot of red flags for OCD. Someone who is constantly writing and erasing. If you ask them why they were doing it, they would say it doesn't look like it's right on the line. It doesn't look perfect. The G doesn't match the G in the line ahead of it. So it's a perfectionism thing. Continually sharpening their pencil. They have to have a perfectly sharpened pencil. One of the things I recommend for that is, giving the child a jar of sharpened pencils at the beginning of every class. Or some kids have solved their own problems and just buy a mechanical pencil, so it's always sharp. Difficulty with transitions, unable to tolerate any change in a day's schedule. Repeated hand washing, perfectionism, not able to turn in their papers or tests for fear of mistakes that are made, repeated checking things over and over and over again. Asking constant questions is a very common thing. They want to make sure they got it right the first time. They could, have their hand in the air raising, asking questions 30 times a class period because they're not 100% sure they got it correct the first time. Obsessive compulsive disorder it's a neurological disorder. You're driven, you're perfectionistic, you're stuck, you have the need to complete, difficulty transitioning, your mental brakes get stuck. Sorry, I went too fast through that one. It's so very similar to the tics because not only is it, your brain ticking, as I mentioned before, but it also, OCD waxes and wanes just like the tics do. It changes all the time, and it also gets worse with stress, anxiety, excitement. All the things that aggravate the tics do the same thing with the OCD. Now, a very high number of kids have ADD, and ADD, next slide is probably, my favorite in my collection. This is my portrait of a hyperactive child. Do you see them? We give them a chair, they're just never there. And kids with ADHD, it is very often just interpreted exclusively as a behavior problem, but it really is a malfunction in the frontal lobe of the brain. And there are 5 characteristics. They are inattentive, impulsive, hyperactive, disorganized, and socially immature. And the one that may be missing is the H, the hyperactivity, and that child will then probably be diagnosed with just ADD, attention deficit disorder, and probably will much more easily fall through the cracks because, unfortunately, it's the hyperactivity that gets the teacher's attention. Now, they're inattentive, which means they're very distractible. They have difficulty sustaining attention for any amount of time. I have always called it a dysregulated auditory system. They have a difficult time. They're distracted by even the smallest extraneous noise. They can't sit near electric clocks. They have trouble with, anything. Somebody, chewing gum next to them could take them completely off task. And because of that, they don't stay on task. They're impulsive. They blurt out without being called on. Don't think before acting. Do dangerous things without thinking of consequences. The hyperactivity, they can't sit still for long periods of time. As most of you know, hyperactivity is the result of an understimulated nervous system, and they're stimulating their nervous system by being in motion. That's what they are doing. And so if you can find some movement that these kids could do that's not disrupting the rest of the class, whether it be finger or toe tapping, squeezing something, chewing gum helps tremendously. I mean, there have been studies done on it. And, if you've got a child who is constantly, tapping their pencil over and over and over, we've had kids like that in our classes. I used to just put a big sponge on their desk and let them tap on the sponge or something soft. So, because when they're getting that movement, they're paying attention better. And I think one of the ones that really results in a lot of kids doing very poorly in school is the fact that most of these kids are horribly disorganized. They have that executive dysfunction. These are the kids who can't keep track of their belongings, trouble organizing their materials, getting started on a task. You give them a long-range assignment or project, you might as well say, honey, get this to me sometime before you die, because that's what it means to them. They have trouble sequencing information, forming goals. They never write down their homework assignment. It just doesn't happen. If they do, they write it on their hand, which they wash, or a piece of paper, which they throw away. They have trouble, therefore, managing their time. They lose everything. They come to class unprepared. Their desks and lockers are disorganized. They don't finish anything that they start. Difficulty managing their workload, and become very quickly overwhelmed. Everything has to be broken down. Another one of my favorite slides. This is the typical executive dysfunction locker, which you see medication did very little for. And as I said before, the fifth characteristic is the social immaturity. Kids with ADHD are often so socially immature. The theory out there is that they are, whatever their chronological age is, you take 2/3 of it, and socially and emotionally, that's where they are. So if you're working with a 15-year-old and you take 2/3 of that, that's 12. And I've worked with kids, 15, and you ask them what reward they want on their behavior chart for their behavior assessment, they will actually tell you that they want something like playing Legos for 20 minutes at the end of the day, because even though they're 15, they're acting more like 10 years old. That's where they are. They have difficulty with social interactions with children their own age. They prefer playing with younger children. They respond in a manner that is not age appropriate, and they don't pick up on social cues that the rest of us pick up on. Lots and lots of suggestions for this, assistance with a teacher for just managing their workload, time management, creative ways of keeping track of assignments. For example, the teacher signing the assignment book each day to make sure it's written down correctly, emailing the assignments home. I have a lot of kids who do that. Emailing the completed assignment once it's done at home, emailing it to the teacher so that it doesn't get lost between home and school. Leaving messages on their home voicemail of things they have to do when they get home that night. Extra set of books at home, huge, huge help. So they don't always get home without the right book in the wrong folder. One little boy I'm working with now has come up with a strategy that I absolutely love. He goes up every day and takes a picture of the assignment on the board, and he's got it in his cell phone, so he doesn't have to worry about, forgetting to write it down or where did he put it. He's got it already. He does that with notes sometimes too. Breaking down assignments. Don't give them a 3-week assignment. Give them, half of the first part for 1 week. Then we take that away and put that away, and we start on part 2. You sometimes have to do that with even individual tests and things. I'm a real proponent of reducing workload. Quality is so much more important than quantity, and it takes them so much longer with all the tics and the obsessions that interfere with what they're trying to get done. Imagine yourself trying to read your homework assignment when your head is shaking back and forth constantly. It's going to take you 3 times longer than the average student, so let's cut down on what they have to do. Preferential seating we talked about. I can't enough tell you the use of technology. We are in such a phenomenal world right now that 3/4 of these problems can be resolved with technology. Testing in a separate location where the distractibility is cut down, where they can tick and not worry about it. Using a headset. When they're doing independent work, let them put a headset on. It cuts out all the distractions. Freedom of movement. Not the entire classroom as their playground, but a place where they can be, where they can get a little movement without disturbing other people. Frequent breaks we talked about. Social skills training. We've talked also, one of the things I mentioned earlier is that a lot of our kids have dysgraphia, which is a disorder that affects the fine motor, visual motor impairment, and it's rampant amongst kids with Tourette, and it's now considered a nonverbal learning disability. And it results in very slow and laborious writing because you have very poor fine motor control. Your hands and your fingers cramp very easily, and as a result of that, your handwriting will be very sloppy. You don't space properly between words. You have irregular margins. The letters are inconsistent. One will be small, one will be big. Everything is illegible that's on the page. And, you know, it just makes homework very difficult to correct because nobody can read it. Inability to copy correctly, that visual motor is part of it. The assignment might say page 21 through 10. They'll write down page 10, 1 through 20. They'll write the assignment down wrong. So that's why we have to have this assignment verifications, because they don't copy things right. They'll reverse letters within a word. Difficulty with written expression, getting thoughts on paper. Difficulty with punctuation, capitalization. And, you know, on top of all, they could write a whole paragraph and not space with between any word, not put one capital letter or punctuation mark, but could get 100 on the punctuation test because they know when to use it. It's just when they're writing they can't use it. And then you add on to that interfering tics, obsessions, like, you know, a kid who has to constantly tap their finger on the page as they write. Sensory issues. I work with a boy right now who can't stand to touch paper. The feel of any kind of normal notebook paper, he can't touch it. So it's very difficult. So they'll need notes provided. And, you know, first thing, I think, first and foremost is have the child, you know, evaluated by an occupational therapist. And then let's look, you know, use a scribe, especially for younger kids. Get them on that computer or word processor, OT services when they're young, classroom notes provided. So many software programs, for example, the Inspiration program for kids with written expression. Voice-activated software, Dragon Speak is the one for the regular computer. All iPods and iPads now have a free app called Dragon Dictation, which they can do their work on. There's so many things. You know, I want to talk a little bit about the behaviors that are associated with Tourette, and I know that it's something that we, you know, not everybody wants to equate with that, but the way I describe it is, you know, it's a person with these disorders, especially with the ADHD component, can exhibit a short fuse, low frustration tolerance that at any moment can lead to an all-out loss of control. They can go into uncontrollable rages or storms for what appears to be no reason. But if we were really to analyze it, we would figure out very quickly that these behaviors are really the result of one or more of their neurological disorders. Unfortunately, they often lead to a diagnosis of an emotional disorder or oppositional defiant disorder, none of which it really is. And we have to kind of look at it. You know, Dr. Ross Green from Massachusetts, and I absolutely love this quote, and I've quoted it a million times over, it's your explanation of a behavior that leads directly to how you respond to it. You know, if you meet the kid that I talked about who was yelling out, "I had sex last night," and you don't know what's wrong with that child, you have no idea he has Tourette, what would you think of that child? Your explanation is he must come from a horrible home, and what a defiant, rotten little kid, and how could he be so disrespectful? But once you find out that that child really has Tourette syndrome and can't help saying that, your whole behavior toward that child changes. You know, you tend to then say, "My God, imagine this poor kid who has to walk through life saying that." So it's your explanation of the behavior that leads directly to how you respond to it. And, you know, one of the things that the new IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, did in 2007 is they mandated that functional behavioral assessments must be conducted and positive behavior plans developed if a child's behavior impedes the learning of that child or another child. It's no longer you might want to do one, you must do one. So if you're having a child with these kind of issues, now the function of this is of the behavior of the child is not always what it appears to be. And usually, as I said before, it's the related disorders that affect the behaviors, and it's so critical to ascertain how the behavior relates to the neurobehavioral disorder in order to provide an appropriate and effective behavior plan. Now, many schools have their own behavior plans, but we have, I myself and another person, Kathy Giordano, who's an education specialist, have actually created a workbook, which I can certainly get you a copy of very easily. It's been published for conducting behavior assessments and writing positive behavior plans for students with this spectrum of disorders, and it really, really works. Takes you right to the source of the problem. And you can really, if you get the teachers to use this, which many of them are more than willing to do, it really makes a difference in figuring it out. My platinum rule has always been, what can we do for the child prior to the behavior instead of what do we do to the child after the behavior? You know, we're so quick to look at punishments and consequences rather than what can we do to support that child and give them the supports that they need before the behavior occurs, and then we prevent it. I've always loved this quote, you must see the child as in trouble and not the cause of trouble, which so many times we do. You know, I'm going to talk very quickly, because I know we're getting toward the end, about the sensory issues. Sensory issues are very often the cause of behavioral issues. These are key. It's a constant bombardment of sensory input, and any child can vacillate between being hyposensitive, to hypersensitive in the course of any given day. If you're hyposensitive, these are the kids who appear sluggish. They may exhibit self-abusive behaviors, hitting themselves. They may pick at skin or scabs, touch rough surfaces, touch surfaces or objects that are soothing, crave rocking or strong, deep muscle compressions, weighted things. Whereas if you're hypersensitive, that means you are sensitive to sudden touch, the feel of certain fabrics. You need to have tags cut out of your clothes. The socks without the seams, they can't stand a sock with a seam. They're very sensitive to bright or fluorescent lights, which so many schools have. Can't tolerate the texture of certain foods in their mouth, sensitive to smells, certain sounds. We already talked about that, dysregulated auditory system. And because of all this, they tend to melt down in noisy environments. If I go into a school and they tell me that most of the behavior problems occur in the cafeteria, in the hallways between classes, on the school bus, I immediately know it's a sensory processing disorder. I've said in IEPs that have allowed the child to leave 3 or 4 minutes early just to avoid the crowded hallways. But always be aware that hallways those are social times for these kids. And so we need to make sure that that IEP says they may leave a few minutes early with a friend, so they're not being punished or isolated because they happen to have this disorder. Avoiding loud, chaotic environments, finding alternate places to eat lunch with a few friends, using the headset, preferential seating, getting involved with the occupational therapist at your school, who will definitely have a lot of good techniques to use with this. Now, as a summary, this is what Tourette looks like. It's got so many components. We've got Tourette, we've got the executive dysfunction, we've got the handwriting issues, OCD, had to put noise to anxiety. These chronically inflexible kids with OCD, they can't change gears quickly, sensory, social skills, memory deficits. Now, you notice I have never once mentioned any of the autistic spectrum disorders, but we now know that there is a huge overlap between the Tourette spectrum and the autistic spectrum, and we often have kids who have both. I don't think we'd call it a comorbid condition, but it's something you have to keep in mind. The processing, I've not mentioned bipolar, but we do have a significant number of kids, low incident but significant, of kids who actually have bipolar with Tourette, the learning disabilities, and of course that constant disinhibition, which makes them say the most inappropriate thing at the most inappropriate time. But if I could quickly, in 1 minute here, sum up, when you're working with kids with these disorders, I think there are 2 messages I would like to leave you with. One of them is that, I have Tourette, it's not who I am, and so many times it's so easy to see the child, to see the tics and not the child, or to see the symptoms and not the child. And granted, if you've got a kid yelling, something across your classroom like I had sex last night, yeah, it's hard to ignore that. But if that's all you see, this particular child was an incredibly talented child. They have, great senses of humor. They're creative. They can be charming. They have so many strengths. But if all we see are the tics and the OCD symptoms and the outward manifestations of the disorder, we just really miss some incredible kids. And I think the last thing, and this is, as you can tell by my presentation style, that if I didn't have a sense of humor, I would never have survived the number of years that I've had Tourette, which is many. And recently, we run a camp every year for kids with Tourette. And last year we had them pretend they were going to be on Letterman, and they had to come up with top 10 Tourette slogans that we then made into T-shirts. And I just picked a few out to show you what some of our kids came up with. Tourette ticks me off. Sometimes I feel like a tick, sometimes I don't. That's one of my favorites. Pop, pop, tick, tick, oh, what a relief it is. Another one of my favorites, I do not obsess, I do not obsess, I do not obsess. We do tick and right from the KFC commercial. My all-time favorite, I do solemnly swear. Whether you're a child or an educator or a parent, if you can't at some point in your life laugh at this disorder, you probably won't survive it. It's very difficult, but you have to find some humor. This is the book that Kelly mentioned at the beginning, the Tourette Syndrome OCD Checklist. I also, at the end of this, so you won't have time to copy them down now, put together some very useful resources, different books that I think some of them are for, like the Explosive Child for Behavior Issues, Out of Sync Child for Kids with Sensory Issues, Executive Skills in Children and Adolescents for the Disorganized Child, just, all kinds of interesting and very useful resources. And as usual, I like to leave my email address, so if anybody has any questions, feel free to email me. I don't mind at all answering questions via email. And I think I've gone about 3 minutes over, but thank you.
All right, thank you. I'm hearing a lot of echo all of a sudden, Kelly.
Yes, it's from Sue's speakers. So if Sue can turn her speakers down.
Okay.
All right, is that a little better? No, I'm still hearing myself. I'm sorry.
Okay, maybe it's Faith's.
Is that better?
Let me try now. That's good. Nope,
Okay.
I'm sorry. Well, you know what? If I'm going to just go ahead and start with the questions, and
All right.
we'll deal with it, okay? Let's see. Can you tell us a little bit about what an appropriate age or grade for a child to begin to advocate for themselves?
Well, I've had kids as young as 8 or 9, really do a pretty good job and blow teachers away. But I think most kids, by the time they're going into middle school, you have to start getting a little used to that, because I think they know their disorder, and they know what's going to help, and they know what's not going to help. And I've had some incredible suggestions. Some kids at that age aren't going to be quite ready, but I think most of them, by the time they're going into middle school, definitely are ready to start advocating. And you need to prepare them. You need to kind of go through lists of accommodations, talk about what the meeting's going to be like. But I think that I go to many, many, many IEP meetings where there are kids from anywhere from 11 years old on attending their own meetings, which I think is fantastic.
And are these kids at that age taking the lead?
Not always taking the lead, but certainly being there to speak for themselves. I think, some of them are very outgoing, and so they will, kind of take the lead. But, not like one little girl that, had a lot of tics and interfered with writing. We were trying to get them to do away with or extend time on these math fact tests that they have to take in elementary school. And she, in the middle of the meeting, just suddenly looked up. She was 8 years old, and she said, the way I look at it is everybody has 3 minutes to do this math fact sheet. And she said, and the way I look at it, during that 3 minutes, I probably tick for 1 minute. So if I were to have 4 minutes, then I would have the same amount of time as everyone else.
Brilliant.
Yeah, amazing for an 8-year-old. But I couldn't have said it as well myself. I mean, she nailed it. So you have to prepare them, but they can do a good job.
Okay, then that's a good segue into the next question. I'd love to hear your ideas on transition skills for an elementary student moving into middle school.
Well, that's the big move, and because they go from having 1 or 2 teachers to having 7 or 8 teachers, and so there are so many things that have to go into that, especially if you've got a child who has a lot of anxiety, the changing, that OCD, difficulty to make change, and also the organization becomes an enormous piece that it wasn't maybe as much so in elementary school because they didn't have as many teachers to deal with. I would say, start early, many visits to the school, picking out that combination lock that they never had to use in elementary school, practicing it with it over the summer, getting the school to assign him or her 2 lockers so that they can keep their coat and things in one locker and their other materials in the other, and setting up before school starts a meeting with those teachers and getting everybody on the same page, because so many times it's going to 8 or 9 classes a day. I was a middle school teacher. I remember that very well. And it's very difficult. Those kids who couldn't keep organized with one teacher are going to fall apart. And you have to really be extremely proactive. And it's not too early to start in January or February of their last year of elementary school. Just so many different ways you can do it. Make sure that they have all the appropriate services that they need if they don't have 504s or IEPs. And if they do have them, to make sure that they have the appropriate accommodations. We have tons of accommodations that that are published that we can recommend, that I've given you the resources for.
It's been my experience too that teachers hype the change from elementary to middle, and they start in 3rd grade.
Yep, they do. Exactly. And the kids are a nervous wreck. Yep. They're an absolute nervous wreck because they think it's going to be, and that's why anything you do to calm their nerves, just that anxiety of like, what if I have to go to the bathroom and the teacher won't let me go? Every little worry becomes so enormous for them, and everything just kind of falls apart. They need to have, and I think it's also good to find a person in that school that can be that go-to person. Make an appointment with the child's guidance counselor. get to know them, make an appointment with a school psychologist, find somebody that you know is going to be, understanding of your child, and that person, when they're having a difficult day, can go to that person. I'm going to just take my little break and go down and talk to Mrs. So-and-so for a few minutes just to get them back on track again. No, they feel so alone in that big school, and everybody else seems to be managing, although they're not. The kid just falls apart.
Yeah.
Middle school is a very big transition.
It's perception.
Yep.
You talk about breaking a long-term task down. So
Yes.
when you say that, do you mean that the work would be turned in as the smaller pieces are completed, or would you, or would it all be held at home, for example, and turned in all at once? The point is, there was a suggestion, the parent made this suggestion to the son's teacher that it be turned in smaller batches, but the teacher did not want to be burdened with accepting things in stages. She wants the finished work all at once.
Right. Well, see, I think it should be the teacher that's breaking it down, to be honest with you.
Okay.
And I realize that that's a lot of work for your regular classroom teacher. That's why a lot of these kids do have, a consultant teacher, resource room teacher who can help them do that. My thing is that if you finish part of it, you've done a great job on it, if you don't turn or give it to someone, I'm not saying turn it in, but give it to someone, you lose it. How many times these kids have finished part one, and then by the time they get to part two and finish part two, they've lost part one. They don't know where they put it. So somebody needs to be, to take, I used to, with kids that I had like that, I just had a folder on their desk with their name. And when they finished it, I would say, now I'm going to keep that for you as we, take a day's break, and then we're going to move on to part two. And we're going to just, not even think about part one anymore. And then at the end, put it all together and get them ready to turn it in.
Okay, because a lot of stuff is done now on computer anyway, so
exactly.
The storage part of it is less of an issue, I think. But it's
think
managing the time.
Yeah, and the problem is a lot of schools are wonderful with technology, and other ones aren't still up to speed with the technology in 2012, and so kids have to run from place to place to save things, to print things. They don't make it easy, so it takes, it's even worse for the disorganized child. But yeah, everybody now carries those little flash drives, and definitely much easier.
Are there standard accommodations that most students with Tourette would require? Like if you had to pick three or that are pretty common.
I would say definitely the preferential seating in the classroom, because that is so important. I mean, I never want to sit center front. I'm not saying put them in the back in the corner, because a lot of these kids have the attention issues and they need to be to the front, but on the side, and preferably by the classroom door so they can take that quick break. The breaks are huge. They really need to take these breaks, whether it's a forced errand that you're asking them to run, or something made up, or they have their little break passes. I think testing in separate locations with extended time is something that most of our kids definitely need, just to calm down the anxiety and the stress, because that just fuels the tics and fuels the OCD. And they also, especially with the vocal tics, they're trying so hard to control those so as not to disturb the rest of the class in a quiet classroom, that they can't get their own work done because that's all they can think about. So just a private room where they can go, and if they need to walk around the desk a couple times, they can do it. Those are biggies right there.
Okay, top of the list then. All right. This is not specifically an education question, but in your experience, would you talk a little about extended family issues, like trying to get everybody on board with the need to have a structure around homework time and maybe calmer family occasions?
You mean how to facilitate that?
Yeah, I think that's what the question means.
It's tough, and I think that it's something that a lot of families aren't used to, but I think with kids like this, the structure is so important. And I think it's, like I work with a lot of parents who will say, the minute you get in from school, you need to sit down and get your homework done so it's out of the way. And for most kids with Tourette, that is probably the worst time. I'm not saying everybody, because every child is unique, but they have been sitting in that chair all day long, taking a little break here or there, but they have to move. And so just saying, go out and play for an hour, ride your bike, swim, do whatever you have to do to get some of this energy out. And then, while I'm cooking dinner, come in and let's sit down and do our homework. So they've had that little outlet, and make that, where they do their homework, how they do their homework, making them wear a headset while they do their homework. So even if it's got music, it cuts out all the external distractions. But I think, to have some sort of a regimented, organized schedule is really an important thing, and it's hard, especially when you have several children in the family, to keep everybody organized.
Yeah, and I think this question kind of dealt with extended family too, with the issues around, family occasions and stuff like that, where kids seem to get really out of control.
Right. Well, and I think sometimes you just have to look at those kind of things, and I think educating the extended family is extremely important, and we have so many great resources to do that. And I think also if you see the child is having a difficult time in some sort of because they do tend to get out of control in these noisy, chaotic environments, I think sometimes they just, without punishing them, as you see them kind of revving up, for me it's preempting, being proactive rather than having to later punish them or have a meltdown that they're so embarrassed by, with all their relatives and cousins the next time they see them. If you can kind of just say, you see them getting a little bit out of control, so let's have a little bit of a break, even if it's nothing more than, could you help me do something and let me get them out of the mainstream for a while.
Mm-hmm.
I think so much of it is trying to be proactive and by doing that, you're teaching kids how to be proactive.
Okay. This question is from a mom with a 10-year-old daughter, I guess, and she's concerned about telling her friends about her diagnosis. And as a result, the daughter is becoming more isolated and reluctant to accept invitations. So can you give any suggestions or advice in that area?
Well, to me, education is the key. I had this disorder for 30 years and didn't know I had it because no one was educated. And I was an educator. And so I didn't know anything about it. And I think there's nothing worse than having to grow up, as I did, dealing with this and, constantly being worried about these kind of social situations and embarrassing yourself and people teasing you. Right now we have so much literature out there that teaches people about this disorder that there shouldn't be the stigma attached to it. And I think if you can just educate other families, it just kind of paves the way for that child. Everybody needs to know. We do a program in our chapter called Welcome to My World that we've been doing around the state, and where the kids with Tourette come and they can bring their siblings, friend, or a couple of friends if they want, and we just help educate the other friends about Tourette and educate their siblings about Tourette if they don't have it. Because I think knowing, education is power. Once people know, it's just a huge, weight lifted off their shoulders because they worry so much about what if people see me doing this. They can't enjoy themselves. You have to find, all the literature out there and find ways to educate everybody.
All right, great. Could you talk a little bit more on the use of technology in the classroom?
Well, to me, I think we're in an age of technology, and I have to say I'm probably not up to speed as much as I should be, but I'm getting better every day. But I think right now 3/4 of the problems that these kids have can be significantly helped with technology. Why are we still requiring kids to learn cursive writing when we know they are never, ever, ever going to be able to learn cursive writing, when we've got such wonderful technology out there? We've got the voice-activated programs. We've got math programs that you can do, math online. We've got so many fantastic programs. One of the things I always encourage parents to do is to ask for an assistive technology evaluation. Something that the school district needs to do to figure out, look at that child with disability and let's figure out, what technology is available. Like I talked about the Inspiration program. It's Inspiration is the name of the program, inspiration.com, but there's a elementary kids version called Kidspiration on the same website. And it's a mind mapping program that helps kids who have a very difficult time getting their thoughts down on paper, which a lot of our kids do. It's very common. And so I think, an assistive technology person will know all the software that's out there, all of the new, the iPods, the iPads, and a lot of these new things, which are so much more portable for the kids to carry around, have a lot of these as free apps on them that can really, I worked with a 13-year-old recently, and he just sits with his iPod to do his homework. He dictates it, it prints up on the screen as he's talking, and then he immediately emails it to his teacher.
Wow.
It's such a simple thing, but it's solving about 5 of his major issues.
You said some...
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to speak over you. You said something at the beginning about a type of evaluation, a technology evaluation. Is that what
Yes,
you called it?
an assistive technology evaluation is something that a parent can request, a teacher can request. And depending on the school district, sometimes they're done by a central education agency. Sometimes they're done by a local, in our area, they're done by a local university, their assistive tech department. And it's not an evaluation of your child, but it's taking all of the issues that your child has. Like you're saying the kid has got maybe tics that are interfering, maybe has got, you know, some OCD that's getting in the way of getting things done, dysgraphia, you know, whatever. And they will look at all the technology that's available out there. They actually bring the child to the assistive tech center and let them even try some of the things, like, you know, word prediction, where they'll type the first couple letters of a word and it'll type out several words that might start with those letters, and they just get to pick the one that they want to type. You know, and they let them try them to see what works best for that child. And
That's
then
cool.
Yeah, oh, it's fantastic. And there, I mean, the technology that's out there blows me away. You know, every single time you know, I'm out doing in a school somewhere, and I find it, it's just amazing to me what's actually out there, but we aren't always aware of that as educators. And so I think it's so important to request that assistive tech eval, and that person who is, you know, the technology expert will say, this is what's out there in educational software that could really help this child, or educational tools. You know, this is what might help.
You mentioned that evaluation, and we had someone else ask about evaluations that you would recommend. So let's wrap it with that question then.
Okay.
Aside from this technology evaluation you just mentioned, what others would you suggest?
Well, I think when the child is evaluated, obviously they'll do the full battery of, you know, psychological tests that schools do. But I think in addition, especially if they're showing any aspects of any of these associated disorders, I would almost exclusively ask for an occupational therapy evaluation to look at both the dysgraphia, the handwriting issues, and the sensory issues, because that's their field. I would also ask many times I will ask parents to be tested for executive dysfunction. There are certain tests you can have done that test that ability to be organized. I mean, they want data. You know, the kid did poorly on this test, so therefore, I mean, it doesn't sometimes take a rocket scientist to see that a kid can't write. You just look at their materials, but the evaluations are important in getting the services. And the other thing is, many of our kids have, and I didn't even mention this one tonight, have processing issues, where they have difficulty processing information, especially auditorily. So, you know, if you say something to give them 3 directions at a time, they will only process at best the first one you gave. So the speech language pathologist in the school is the one that is definitely needing to evaluate this kid if they're showing any signs of that whatsoever. So those are other evaluations you can ask for.
Okay. All right. I think we are out of time, so I'm going to wrap it up here tonight. Sue, thank you very much. It was a great presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for joining our webinar on Sleep and Developmental Disabilities, Lessons for All Children. There is an exit survey which we need everyone attending to fill out. The discussion board is now open and available for the next 7 days on the NJCTS website for any additional questions that were not covered in tonight's presentation. That website is www.njcts.org. Also, an archived recording of tonight's webinar will be posted to the website. Our next presentation, Anxiety in the Undergraduate, Common Difficulties Due to Anxiety and How Post-Secondary Educators Can Help, will be presented on Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Savings Time by Dr. Julie Ryan. This ends tonight's webinar. Thank you, Sue, for your presentation, and thank you everyone for attending. Good night.